Berlin, 1943. The city throbbed with tension, a heartbeat of fear and fervor. Sirens cut through the dense fog of smoke rising from bombed-out neighborhoods. Among the shadows, Friedrich Weber moved quietly, a man whose presence seemed invisible to all but the highest echelons of power. A spy within his own country, Friedrich had spent years delivering intelligence to the Abwehr. But lately, his loyalty had begun to fracture, not from fear of the Allies, but from an unshakable certainty. The Reich was dying from the inside out. His office, tucked behind the ornate facade of a government building, was a shrine of contradictions. Maps of occupied Europe lay next to personal photographs of his family, their smiling faces a painful reminder of what the war had stolen. Friedrich's hands hovered over a cipher machine, decoding messages that spoke of imminent defeats, logistical collapses, and political betrayals. Every word he intercepted painted a bleak portrait of a nation crumbling under its own arrogance. Outside, the streets were alive with propaganda. Posters screamed loyalty to Hitler, promising victory where none would come. Children marched in school parades, their tiny boots echoing over cobblestones that had long carried the weight of history. And yet Friedrich saw through it all. He had begun to notice the fissures, the whispered doubts among officers, the fear behind the speeches, the tremor in the hands of those who preached courage. For years he had convinced himself that his work was a duty, a shield against the chaos that could engulf Europe. But now, the truth was undeniable. The Reich's machinery was faltering, driven not only by the relentless pressure of the Allies but also by the rot of its ideology, its cruelty, and the blind ambition of men too intoxicated with power to see reason. Friedrich knew that the fall would come, not tomorrow, perhaps, but inevitably. And when it did, he would be forced to decide: remain loyal to a dying empire, or embrace a future that might demand betrayal, sacrifice, and the courage to face what others refused to see. He lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly, the smoke curling like a question mark over his desk. Somewhere in London, someone would read the message he had just encoded. Somewhere, hope flickered. But here, in the heart of Berlin, Friedrich felt the pulse of the nation on the brink, and he knew that shadows were no longer enough to hide him from what was coming. By early 1944, the Wehrmacht was a fractured reflection of its former glory. Friedrich sat in a dimly lit room, leafing through intercepted reports that described lost fronts, supply shortages, and the growing despair of soldiers far from home. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the relentless advance of the Red Army, while in the West, the Allies' aerial bombardments had turned cities into ash. Every message he decoded revealed the same pattern: a once mighty military choked by overreach, hubris, and strategic folly. Friedrich's eyes lingered on a telegram from a field commander: food supplies for thousands of troops would not arrive for another week. Morale was plummeting. Desperation seeped into every rank, turning once loyal men into bitter, disillusioned shadows. For the first time, Friedrich felt a chilling certainty: the Reich's downfall was not just possible, it was inevitable. But it wasn't only the army. Political infighting gnawed at the Nazi leadership. Speeches and decrees from Berlin were hollow, out of touch with reality. Ministers argued over meaningless titles, and Hitler's inner circle became a theater of paranoia and betrayal. Friedrich realized that the very structure that had made Germany formidable was now its own worst enemy. Ideology had become chains, devotion had become blindness, and ambition had become a slow poison. Even those he had once considered allies were beginning to show cracks. A colonel in the Abwehr, whom Friedrich had trusted for years, hinted at disillusionment, whispering that loyalty to the Reich was now a liability. Every conversation, every intercepted letter, was another thread unraveling the tapestry of a crumbling empire. Yet Friedrich moved carefully. He could not act recklessly. A single misstep could mean imprisonment, or death. His spy work required a delicate balance: report enough to maintain trust, but withhold enough to preserve his conscience. Each night, he reviewed the maps and documents spread before him, tracing the inexorable collapse that was sweeping across Europe. And with each passing day, Friedrich felt the weight of inevitability pressing down, heavier than any uniform or medal he had ever worn. The Reich, once a colossal machine of power and terror, was nothing more than a fragile edifice, cracking under the strain of its own ambition. In those moments, Friedrich understood the terrible truth: survival might demand choices he had never imagined, and history was already writing its verdict, without mercy, without pause, and without hope for those who refused to see. Friedrich had always believed that knowledge was power, but now he understood that some truths carried only burdens. Each intercepted message, each confidential report, was a reminder of the suffering hidden behind propaganda. He read letters from soldiers' families pleading for news, reports of villages burned in the east, and orders that demanded loyalty at the expense of humanity. The Reich's machinery was not just failing, it was crushing everything in its path. One evening, a courier delivered a thin envelope sealed with the Abwehr's insignia. Inside were plans for a counterintelligence operation, an attempt to root out dissent within the ranks. Names of colleagues, officers, even civilians suspected of disloyalty were listed. Friedrich recognized a few of them. Some were friends he had trained with. Others were ordinary citizens caught in the gears of a brutal regime. His hands trembled as he folded the papers. Acting on this information would be complicity, ignoring it would be betrayal. Either choice was a moral abyss. In the quiet of his apartment, Friedrich paced, cigarette ash falling like snow onto the floor. The city outside groaned under the weight of air raids, its streets scarred by rubble and fear. Every night, Berlin became a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Informers lurked in cafes, neighbors reported on neighbors. Trust was a currency rarer than gold, and Friedrich's conscience had begun to cost him more than he could bear. He began to understand the subtle ways in which the Reich was devouring its own people. Soldiers deserted, civilians hoarded food, and officers conspired behind closed doors. The state's obsession with loyalty had created a society where fear reigned supreme, and hope had become a dangerous illusion. Friedrich realized he was no longer just an observer. He had become a participant in a tragedy whose scale was almost impossible to comprehend. At night, he often stared at the ceiling, asking himself whether survival was worth complicity, whether intelligence could be used to mitigate harm, or whether every choice he made would simply accelerate the suffering. He knew that the Reich would fall, but what role would he play in its collapse? Could he remain a shadow within the system, quietly recording its demise, or would he be forced to take actions that might save lives at the cost of his own safety? Friedrich exhaled a long stream of smoke. The war was no longer about strategy or victory, it was about conscience. And in the silence of his room, he felt the crushing truth: the Reich was doomed, and he was trapped in the terrible space between knowledge and action. By the spring of 1944, Berlin had become a city of ghosts. Air raid sirens shattered the nights, and families huddled in cellars, listening to the distant thunder of Allied bombs. Friedrich walked among the ruins, a ghost himself, invisible yet hyper-aware of every glance, every whisper. The Reich's desperation had made its citizens, once loyal, now terrified, both hunters and prey. Within this atmosphere of fear, Friedrich began to make small, deliberate choices. He could not stop the war, nor could he dismantle the Reich from within. But he could shield a few lives, delay a few arrests, and quietly subvert the machinery of cruelty. Using the intelligence he intercepted, he began redirecting some reports, delaying operations, and quietly signaling warnings to those he knew were at risk. Each act was a calculated gamble. A single misstep could lead to arrest, torture, or death. Yet the cost of inaction weighed heavier on his conscience than any personal danger. He had learned to read people as keenly as he read documents. Officers who seemed loyal were often corrupted by fear. Those who whispered doubt carried the potential for survival. Friedrich began keeping a mental ledger of trust, noting who might help, who might betray, and who was too lost to save. In every corridor, every office, every train, he walked a tightrope, balancing truth, deception, and morality. The paradox tormented him. He was both a servant and a saboteur. Every report he delivered kept him in favor with his superiors, but every carefully concealed warning protected lives from the very Reich he served. Each night, he replayed the day's choices, questioning whether small victories against injustice mattered in a world engulfed by overwhelming violence. Yet the faces of those he had saved, children hidden from Gestapo raids, families warned of impending deportations, were proof that even shadows could leave a mark. But the Reich was relentless. Paranoia spread like wildfire through the ranks, and Friedrich felt the tightening noose of suspicion. Surveillance intensified. Colleagues were interrogated, some never seen again. In this climate, even minor miscalculations could be fatal. He knew that his actions were building toward a point of no return. One day, his choices would force him to reveal himself fully, or vanish into obscurity forever. As he left his office that evening, the setting sun painted the crumbling city in shades of fire and ash. Friedrich looked over Berlin and understood that his war was not just against the enemy abroad, it was against fear, complicity, and the moral decay consuming his own nation. And somewhere deep in his chest, a quiet resolve began to take root. He would not allow the Reich to claim all lives without leaving a trace of resistance, however fragile it might be. Summer 1944 arrived with a heat that made Berlin suffocating. Bombed-out streets steamed in the sun, and the smell of smoke and rot clung to the air like a curse. Friedrich had grown accustomed to the rhythm of danger, each day a delicate negotiation between survival and conscience, but the stakes were escalating. Reports from the front grew more desperate, entire divisions lost, supply lines severed, commanders questioning orders, and the Allies pressing ever closer. One morning, a colleague arrived at his office, a man Friedrich had trusted for years. The conversation was casual, almost banal, until the colleague, nervously glancing over his shoulder, leaned in and whispered of a new purge targeting suspected spies within the Abwehr. Friedrich's stomach twisted. Among the names listed were people he had once saved, people who trusted him. The Reich's paranoia was no longer distant, it had arrived at his door, ready to crush anyone who dared to think beyond obedience. That night, Friedrich studied the intelligence he had collected, seeking a path through the tightening net. He realized that each choice carried the weight of betrayal, not only toward the Reich, but toward those who depended on him. To protect the innocent, he would have to deceive friends, mislead colleagues, and manipulate even those he considered allies. Every act of preservation would be a lie, every secret a knife against the very fabric of trust. And yet Friedrich could not ignore the truth he had glimpsed so clearly. The Reich was unraveling, not because of external pressure alone, but because of its own cruelty, fear, and incompetence. Those in power were blind to the collapse, clinging to ideology while the world slipped through their fingers. Friedrich's conscience would not allow him to stand by while men, women, and children became casualties of that blindness. He began to craft his strategies with surgical precision. Messages were rerouted, innocuous errors planted, and warnings whispered in code to those at risk. It was a delicate dance, a high-stakes game of chess played in shadows, where one misstep could ignite suspicion and annihilation. Each success was tempered by the constant fear that the next miscalculation could undo everything. As he returned to his apartment, Friedrich paused at the window, looking over the city. Berlin was a place of contradictions, beauty and destruction, loyalty and betrayal, hope and despair. He felt the weight of all his choices pressing down, heavier than any uniform or medal he had ever worn. And in the stillness of that night, he resolved that no matter the cost, he would see the Reich's inevitable collapse with his own eyes, and he would ensure that those who could be saved would be. By late 1944, the Reich's illusion of invincibility had shattered. The Allies advanced relentlessly from the west, and the Soviets pushed from the east. Reports flooded Friedrich's desk, each one more damning than the last. Entire regiments surrounded, communications severed, retreat orders ignored. The army's morale had collapsed. Soldiers were deserting, looting, or surrendering without orders. Even the most decorated officers were losing faith, their rigid discipline crumbling under the weight of inevitable defeat. Friedrich moved cautiously through his office, rifling through telegrams and dispatches. He observed patterns that others missed, the panic concealed behind rigid reports, the desperation masked by obedience. Every piece of information confirmed what he had feared for years. The Reich was not only failing militarily, it was imploding from within. Political purges, logistical nightmares, and ideological fanaticism had created a perfect storm of collapse. One morning, a report arrived detailing the execution of officers suspected of dissent. Among the names was a man Friedrich had once saved, a friend whose loyalty had seemed unquestionable. Rage and sorrow collided in him. The Reich's paranoia had become monstrous, consuming anyone who dared to think independently. Friedrich understood that the choice was no longer theoretical: act to protect those who could be saved, or remain a silent witness to systematic annihilation. He began to take bolder measures. Coded warnings were sent to underground contacts, false intelligence misdirected patrols, and resources discreetly rerouted to protect civilians caught in the path of the collapsing front. Each action risked discovery, each choice required deception of colleagues and subordinates alike. The tension was suffocating. Friedrich's every movement was measured, calculated, performed in a theater of fear where the wrong gesture could be fatal. Amid the chaos, Friedrich also witnessed moments of humanity. Soldiers hiding children, villagers sharing scarce food, officers quietly sparing lives despite the orders they were given. These glimpses of moral courage strengthened his resolve. The Reich might be doomed, but the small acts of resistance he could orchestrate were a reminder that not all hope had been extinguished. From his vantage point in the crumbling city, Friedrich understood the brutal paradox of his existence. He was both participant and observer, both traitor and savior. The Reich's fall was inevitable, but the impact of his actions, tiny, imperceptible, yet significant, could still shape the lives of those around him. And in this understanding, he found a grim sense of purpose. The world outside might be tearing itself apart, but he would ensure that he did not stand idle in the destruction. Winter 1944 had settled over Berlin, a cold as biting as the fear that gripped the city. The Reich, once a colossus of power, now staggered under the weight of its failures. Friedrich navigated streets lined with rubble and frost, feeling the eyes of the paranoid, the desperate, and the complicit. Each corner held the threat of betrayal. Every colleague could be an informer, every glance a trap. The crisis reached Friedrich's door in the form of an intercepted message. One of his closest contacts within the Abwehr had reported anomalies in transmissions. The man was suspicious, and suspicion in the Reich was fatal. Friedrich realized that his careful manipulations, his small acts of resistance, had placed him squarely in the crosshairs of those who valued loyalty over truth. Every ally, every innocent he had protected, was now endangered by a single misstep. The city's streets mirrored the chaos of the message. Berlin's citizens moved like shadows, whispering rumors, sharing coded information, and quietly planning escape or survival. Soldiers patrolled the avenues with icy rigidity, while officers issued contradictory orders, each more absurd than the last. Friedrich had witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior under duress: courage, cowardice, cruelty, and compassion all mingled in the frozen air. He knew he could not remain passive. A confrontation was inevitable. He spent long nights crafting contingencies, mapping escape routes, and preparing coded messages that could save lives if discovered. Every decision carried the weight of multiple fates. One wrong choice, and not just he but dozens of innocents would be condemned. The Reich's paranoia had transformed survival into a precise calculus, each move a gamble with stakes higher than any battlefield. In the silence of his apartment, Friedrich rehearsed the confrontation in his mind. The man who had grown suspicious, an officer he had once considered a friend, would be the test of his ingenuity and courage. Friedrich realized that betrayal was not only external, it could also be forced upon him. To navigate the collapsing Reich, he would have to embrace deception, manipulation, and cold reasoning, tools he had used sparingly until now, but which were now essential for survival. The city outside groaned under the weight of war, fires smoldering in distant neighborhoods, and sirens announcing raids that blurred the line between life and death. Friedrich understood that his choices were no longer optional. The Reich's collapse demanded action, and every moment of hesitation increased the cost. The fall of an empire was imminent, and he would have to walk through the storm of betrayal, fear, and moral compromise to see it through. Spring 1945 brought with it the deafening roar of inevitability. Berlin, once a city of order and pride, now lay in ruins. Fires raged across the skyline, smoke curling into a gray sky that seemed to mourn the city itself. The Allies pressed from the west, the Soviets from the east, and the Reich's forces, demoralized and fragmented, offered only a hollow resistance. Every street, every building, every alley was a testament to the empire's unraveling. Friedrich moved like a shadow through the chaos, navigating checkpoints and barricades, the smell of gunpowder and decay filling his lungs. Intelligence reports no longer flowed in measured updates. They were frantic, contradictory, and despairing. Entire divisions had disintegrated, supply lines were non-existent, and the political hierarchy had descended into incoherent panic. The Reich was no longer fighting a war. It was staggering toward oblivion. Amid the ruins, Friedrich faced his most dangerous task yet, to protect a small network of civilians and officials who had secretly resisted the regime. The Allies' advance offered a chance for survival, but only if he could guide them through streets teeming with collapsing infrastructure, desperate soldiers, and rampant SS patrols executing those deemed disloyal. One misstep, one misread signal, could mean death for all. Friedrich's mind raced as he coordinated routes, falsified orders, and sent coded instructions. Every action demanded precision, every choice weighed heavily on his conscience. He recalled the faces of those he had saved, the children hidden from the Gestapo, the officers spared from execution. Their lives were now intertwined with his decisions, and their survival depended on his ability to navigate a city that had become both battlefield and labyrinth. But even in the chaos, Friedrich observed small acts of humanity. Soldiers shared rations with civilians, neighbors protected neighbors, and in quiet moments, whispered prayers and songs persisted amid the destruction. These glimpses of resilience fueled him, even as the Reich's collapse became unavoidable. By nightfall, Friedrich had shepherded a dozen families through the maze of ruin. The city, once a symbol of power, now echoed with uncertainty, despair, and fleeting hope. He paused on a rooftop, looking over Berlin as fires illuminated the horizon like veins of molten metal. The empire was dying, and he had survived to witness it, not as a conqueror, not as a hero, but as a man who had glimpsed the truth and acted with conscience when the world had lost its sense of morality. In that moment, Friedrich understood that the fall of the Reich was more than a military defeat. It was the collapse of ideology, of fear, and of blind obedience. And in the midst of the rubble, he felt a flicker of something precious, the quiet power of choice, of human decency, surviving even in the darkest of times. May 1945 arrived with a fragile, uneasy quiet. The Reich had fallen, its cities smoking ruins and its leaders either dead, captured, or in hiding. Berlin, once the epicenter of a formidable empire, was now a shattered mosaic of bombed-out buildings, abandoned vehicles, and streets littered with the remnants of a society that had collapsed under its own weight. The war was over, yet the silence was deafening. Friedrich wandered through the rubble-strewn avenues, observing the tentative emergence of survivors. Faces once hardened by fear now reflected disbelief, grief, and a strange, cautious relief. Families reunited amid ruins, children playing among debris, soldiers laying down arms, and civilians surveying the fragments of their lives. Every step through the broken city reminded him of the delicate balance between survival and complicity that he had navigated for years. The cost of survival weighed heavily on him. Friedrich had saved lives, guided the vulnerable, and subtly undermined the machinery of cruelty. But each act had been shadowed by deception, manipulation, and the moral compromises he had made to stay alive. Some of those he had protected would never know the true danger he had shielded them from. Others, perhaps, would judge him harshly if they did. The fall of the Reich had spared him physically, but the echoes of guilt, choices, and betrayals would linger far longer. He visited a small memorial in a shattered square, a simple, improvised marker for civilians and soldiers alike, victims of ideology and war. Friedrich placed a single hand on the cold stone, feeling a connection not to victory, but to endurance, conscience, and the fragile humanity that had survived amid devastation. He had witnessed the collapse of an empire built on fear, and though the world outside would remember the Reich as a cautionary tale of tyranny, he understood that the quiet, unseen acts of resistance were equally important, though largely unrecorded. For the first time in years, Friedrich allowed himself to breathe. The city, still haunted by destruction and loss, seemed to exhale alongside him. The Reich was gone, but he remained, a witness to history, a participant in survival, and a man forever changed by the choices he had made. In the quiet aftermath, he realized that freedom and morality had not been granted, they had been seized, carved from the rubble of destruction and the courage of those who refused to surrender their humanity. Berlin was silent, but it was alive with possibility. Friedrich, too, had survived, not as a conqueror, not as a victor, but as someone who had seen the truth, acted within it, and emerged from the shadows to face the dawn of a world that was beginning to rebuild. The months after the Reich's collapse were a liminal space between ruin and reconstruction. Berlin, though scarred beyond recognition, stirred with tentative life. Markets reopened amid the rubble, neighbors shared meager rations, and displaced families sought shelter wherever they could. Friedrich moved through the city like a man unmoored, observing both the physical devastation and the moral reckoning unfolding in every street, every face. He had survived the fall not by chance, but through careful calculation, courage, and choices few could comprehend. Yet survival carried its own burden. Every life he had protected, every subtle act of resistance, left him with a quiet, gnawing awareness of the lives he could not save. The Reich's cruelty had consumed millions, and he was left standing among the remnants, haunted by both loss and what he had preserved. Friedrich understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that history was not only written by the victors but shaped in countless unseen moments of conscience. The propaganda, the ideology, the fanatical devotion that had fed the Reich's rise now lay in ashes, but the memory of it lingered in minds and hearts. He realized that the true victory over tyranny was never merely military. It was moral, human, and profoundly personal. He began documenting what he had witnessed, carefully recording events, intelligence, and the stories of those who had survived through courage, cunning, or luck. These were not tales of glory or heroism in the traditional sense. They were chronicles of survival, conscience, and the small, decisive acts that kept humanity alive amid the machinery of destruction. In doing so, Friedrich sought to preserve not only the truth of the Reich's fall but the lessons it demanded. Vigilance against tyranny, the power of moral choice, and the resilience of the human spirit. In the quiet of a Berlin dawn, Friedrich stood atop a crumbling building, looking out over a city slowly stirring to life. Smoke still lingered, and the streets bore the scars of war, but sunlight pierced the clouds with a fragile promise. He exhaled, feeling a strange clarity. The Reich had fallen, yet the world endured, and within that endurance, there remained a space for courage, morality, and hope. Friedrich's role in history was invisible to most, yet it was real, significant, and enduring. He had acted in the shadows, navigated betrayal, and preserved life against impossible odds. And as Berlin began to rebuild, he understood the profound truth he would carry forever. Empires could fall, but conscience, courage, and the quiet choices of ordinary people could survive, and perhaps, in time, shape a better world. The city breathed anew, and Friedrich Weber, the spy who had seen the fall of the Reich, stepped forward into a future uncharted, burdened but unbroken, a witness to history and a guardian of its moral lessons.